Welcome to the JFK Facts podcast. Jim Risen, author of The Last Honest Man, and Thomas Risen, co-author of The Last Honest Man, a biography of Frank Church, who in a lot of ways in the study of the assassination of President Kennedy is really a key figure and underappreciated, maybe not even a household name anymore. So when Frank Church came to prominence, I'll introduce our story here. When Frank Church came to prominence in 1975, he was a senator from Idaho, and the big news of the day was a scandal involving the CIA and counterintelligence chief James Angleton, which is headline news in the New York Times, a story by Seymour Hersh, sensational revelations rock Washington. And so what happens next, Jim? How does Frank Church enter this story about the CIA, and where does it lead?
Oh, thanks for having me. And in 1975, as you say, it was Cy Hersh's big investigation was published right before Christmas in December 1974.
Mhm.
And it was it created a huge firestorm because it revealed that the CIA had been conducting a massive domestic spying operation on American citizens, primarily anti-war dissidents and civil rights activists, and had done so illegally. And that he also hinted at a lot of other CIA operations and talked a little bit about other CIA operations, even though the focus of the story was on the domestic spying operations.
Mhm.
And this had, if you remember, this came just a few months after Richard Nixon resigned after Watergate.
Right.
And
So Nixon has resigned in August of 1974. First
right,
time an American president has resigned.
right.
Gerald Ford becomes president. He's never been elected to national office.
Right.
So,
And so Ford is kind of politically crippled because the
yeah.
Democrats hold massive majorities in Congress in both the House and the Senate. In the midterm elections in 1974, they got landslide victories, and there were 60 Democrats in the Senate and like 294 in the House, something like that. And the Supreme Court had ruled against Nixon on executive privilege, which led him to turn over the White House tapes that led to his final resignation. And so, politically and legally, Gerald Ford was in a difficult spot to fight off a big congressional investigation. And the Democrats wanted to mount a major investigation of the CIA, which at that time, you got to remember, there were no oversight committees of the CIA. The Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee did not exist. And there had never been any real oversight of the CIA for its first 30 years in existence.
Yeah, if I could
And
just interject a story there, that CIA Director Richard Helms, when he would want approval of the CIA budget, he would go to one man, the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and say, "Here's my budget," and that one man would say, "Okay, you have it," and that was it. Is that right?
yes,
Sometimes they would say, "Do you have enough?"
yeah. And
That is true. That is documented.
they would always say, we don't want to know any of your secrets. Just, basically take the money and run.
Yeah.
And so when the Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield wanted to create an oversight committee, a special committee, and he was looking for a chairman of that committee, and he first thought of Senator Phil Hart of Michigan, who was kind of beloved on both sides of the aisle. Everybody liked him, even though he was a liberal. But he had cancer, and he told Mansfield he couldn't do it, and suggested instead that Frank Church do it because he knew that Church was interested. And Church was in a difficult spot. He had just decided to run for president in 1976, but he decided to push for becoming chairman of this committee, even though he wanted to run for president. And Mansfield kind of won a promise from him not to run for president while he conducted the investigation. And so Church came in as chairman in January 1975 and basically then had to decide, what do we investigate? There's 30 years of stuff that nobody knows about. And so that sets the table for their investigation.
Right. Part of the backdrop too is at that time, or one of the revelations that had led to Nixon's resignation was that the CIA had in fact helped the Watergate burglars at different points, helped them investigate Daniel Ellsberg and try and smear him. And so it wasn't just the New York Times story, but there had also been a residue of CIA
Right,
revelations out of the Watergate story that added weight to this.
right, right. One of the things that the biggest time bomb sitting inside the CIA when the Church Committee was created was something called the family jewels, which in 1973, the then CIA director, James Schlesinger, found out what you just said, that the CIA had been more involved in Watergate than Richard Helms had said publicly when he testified before the Senate Watergate Committee. And so he ordered everyone at the CIA to tell him anything that they had done that was illegal in the past or that could lead to bad press or bad publicity or negatively impact the CIA. And he put it all in a big memo that was called the Family Jewels. And that was sitting inside the CIA at the time of the Church Committee was formed, like a time bomb waiting to go off.
Right. So some of the things then the committee in formation is buffeted by more revelations. First, the Castro assassination plots. So that's not even originally what they're coming to investigate, but what happens?
Well, Gerald Ford calls in the executive editor of the New York Times after Hirsch's story, along with some other editors. And they're talking about the CIA, and Ford is trying to get them to give him time to create his own internal investigation, and basically is trying to stonewall the New York Times and not be so aggressive in their investigation, and tells them that there's a lot of secrets that shouldn't come out. And Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor, says, like what? And Ford blurts out, like assassinations. And then he says, but that's off the record. And he puts the New York Times in an awkward position because the editor had just found this out, but he had been told by the president it was off the record. So when Cy Hirsch finds out about it, he knows he can't report on it, so he leaks it to CBS, to Daniel Shore. And so CBS breaks the story. And then that all hell breaks loose, and the whole the Church Committee starts investigating the CIA's plots to kill foreign leaders.
And then there's another revelation. In
Which
February,
one?
March, the Zapruder film is shown on national TV for the first time. And how does that impact where the investigation is going?
I don't
Well,
know that it impacts it, but it does add some tension to it because the Kennedys kind of loom over it as they dig deeper and deeper and discover that the Kennedys, they thought this would just be uncovering more dirty deeds by Richard Nixon, who was used like I think at least one of two of the Watergate burglars were Cuban dissidents, and at least one of them was involved in some of the sabotage stuff after the plots to kill Castro. So, you have a lot of former CIA officers who were involved in the Watergate burglary. So there's a lot of suspicions about Nixon and the CIA already. And
Yeah.
they think they're going to find more of the same. But then they find out the Kennedys and Johnson and Eisenhower all, abuse the power of the CIA. So that probably has some really, the Zapruder film probably kind of just adds to the mystique of the whole investigation. It's 1975. It's a really big, crazy year for everyone paying
Right.
attention to government.
Right. So this really lifts church to a position of national prominence. This is a big story. All of these revelations coming on top of each other about the CIA and rapid. And so what does Church do? How does he handle this?
Well, he decides to focus first on the assassinations of foreign leaders, including Castro. And the main focus early on of the committee is the CIA's secret alliance with the Mafia to kill Castro, which had been started at the very end of the Eisenhower administration and continued under the Kennedy administration. And for Church, this is an awkward situation because John Kennedy was a close friend of his in the Senate, and then when he was president, he's the only president that Church was ever friends with. And Ted Kennedy, the younger brother of John Kennedy, is still in the Senate at the time. And so the awkwardness is palpable for the Church Committee as they begin to investigate not the Nixon administration, but the Kennedy administration.
Uh-huh.
And Church took a lot of criticism in the public because people assumed that he was going to pull his punches on Kennedy. But in fact, he didn't. He allowed the investigation to go forward. And maybe Tom can talk about the big explosive bombshell they found about Judith Campbell and Sam Giancana and John Kennedy.
Yeah, it just kind of, it's another thing that adds to the mystique, but it is a lead that they follow. It doesn't pan out that Kennedy is dating, one of his mistresses is Judith Campbell, who is an actress who, and divorcee, who is also dating Sam Giancana because, she's newly divorced. She's back on, back in the dating, everything. And so they think, oh, the same, someone goes and checks FBI records to see, what because Sam Giancana is one of the people involved in the plot to kill Fidel Castro. The CIA is looking at, long story short, the CIA is looking at ways to remove Fidel Castro. They think, hey, the Mafia doesn't like Castro either. They just lost their casinos in Cuba. Let's talk to them. They know how to kill people. And
Yeah,
so they
and
reach out. Yeah.
I should interject that Sam Giancana is the crime boss of Chicago. He's one of the biggest crime bosses in the country, the successor to Al Capone. So he's a major figure, and he's not just another organized crime guy. He's a major figure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so they enlist a man named Johnny Rosselli, who is he works with the Chicago Mafia and, is, not, yeah, he works mainly with the Chicago Mafia. And then they decide, he says, okay, I have to bring my boss into this because I have to tell him what I'm doing. And so Sam Giancana gets involved. And then Santo Traficante gets involved because they're operating in Florida. Santo Traficante is the boss of Tampa. So these three mafiosi are the ones kind of consulting the CIA on the best ways to kill Castro. They decide poison pills are the way to go about it. And by the time they figure this out at the church committee, another staffer goes and digs around in FBI files and finds phone records. And it turns out that there are calls that have been going to Sam Giancana, from Sam Giancana's house to the White House. And he figures this out and he says, hey, maybe Judith Campbell, who's dating Sam Giancana and John F. Kennedy, is a go-between. And this becomes a big point of contention. The committee is wondering whether they should dig into this because it's his personal life. And, but Frank Church says, go ahead, go dig into it, just in case. And they do interviews. It doesn't turn out she is not a go-between, but they really dig into it and they do a lot of interviews. So that kind of shows that he doesn't pull his punches. He's willing to dig into the slain president's personal life.
Mm-hmm. And what do they find?
Well,
they find
They conclude.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, they conclude that she wasn't a go-between, but this is a major point of contention because it kind of it's a trail that leads them to realize that Kennedy did know about the plot to kill Fidel Castro with the help of the mafia. And it turned, because John J. Edgar Hoover also finds out about Sam Giancana and Judith Campbell and everything. And so while they're in Miami and planning ways to kill Fidel Castro, Sam Giancana is suspicious of another one of his girlfriends who is in Las Vegas at the time. So he gets one of the contractors working with the CIA to bug her hotel, and these surveillance people get caught, and they tell the FBI, "Hey, we're talk to the government. We're on duty here," and that finds its way up the chain to J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover says, "Oh, I've got something on Kennedy now." And there's briefing materials. We don't know exactly what was said between John F. Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover, but there's briefing materials for a meeting that Hoover had with Kennedy where Judith Campbell is mentioned in that briefing. So it kind of, it's kind of a smoking gun that Kennedy knew about the plot to kill Fidel Castro by the CIA with the help of the mafia.
Right. And so I'll just add, I mean, part of the context of what was going on, one of the reasons why people were interested was that Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson had reported that sources closest to Rosselli, meaning Rosselli himself, had said that the Castro assassination plots had led to the assassination of President Kennedy. So that was part of what these crime bosses were reputed to know. And the story they told was that Castro had learned about the assassination plots and he had turned around and organized a plot to kill Kennedy. So that story was floating through or in circulation at the time the Zapruder film was seen
Right.
for the first time, and at the time that they're investigating these Castro assassination plots.
Yeah, he talked to Jack Anderson years before the Church Committee.
Yeah.
I forget exactly which year, but it's before he was using a fake name, like a lot of Italian gangsters back then, because they could just deport you to Italy. Judges were more free with that if you were a criminal and you weren't a green card citizen. So he had a fake name that he used for years. They figured out who he was, and he talks to Jack Anderson in hopes that it would pressure the CIA to intervene and maybe prevent him from getting deported.
Right.
So he has an agenda when he's telling this story. But it does again creates more mystique around this, and people kind of have all these suspicions.
Yeah. So,
The suspicions were, I was just going to add, the suspicions then ultimately became stronger when Sam Giancana when the church committee asked Sam Giancana to testify, right before he was supposed to testify, he was murdered in his house in Chicago
right.
in 1975. And then Johnny Rosselli was murdered after he testified to the church committee.
Yeah, we got police files on their murders, and we looked into, who might have done it, how it went, and all of
And
that. And
what did those files tell you?
it looks like a mafia hit. It's usually not just one thing where mafiosi end up dead. Talking to the Senate did not help their
Uh-huh.
case. But, as long as you keep making money for the mafia, they have a reason to keep you around. And by 1975, both Giancana and Rosselli are older and they're not earning, as they say. They're both a liability. And the person who probably at least, approved the hits was Tony Accardo. He was the real power behind the throne in Chicago. So he had been Al Capone's bodyguard. He was ruthless. Like, that scene in The Untouchables where Al Capone beats someone to death with a bat? That's based
Uh-huh.
on Tony Accardo.
Uh-huh.
That's based on Tony Accardo because Tony Accardo infamously beat a couple of guys to death with a bat. And Al Capone says, "That's a real Joe Batters. Look at that guy. He kills people with a bat." So this is not a man to be messed with. So he probably approved the hits, if,
So you
at
think
least.
that the deaths of Rosselli and Giancana can be attributed to another organized crime figure?
Yeah,
Uh, you know,
I think you
Uh,
can argue that Accardo and the Chicago mob authorized the hits in both cases.
mhm.
At the time that Johnny Rosselli was testifying before the church committee, he had also been testifying before a grand jury uh, in Los Angeles about the Detroit mob's connections to casinos in Las Vegas. And at the time that he was murdered, Sam Giancana he was about to testify before the church committee, but he had also been testifying before a grand jury in Chicago about the Chicago mob. Not anything current, but historic things that have been done.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I believe that, as Tom said, there's not any one reason why the mob kills somebody. I
Mhm.
think there's several reasons. And I think all those things together, talking to the church committee and talking to grand juries, uh, they just decided these people talk too much.
Yeah.
And
How did I talked to Gary Hart about this one time, who investigated
yeah,
those murders and said after he saw the crime scene pictures on Rosselli, he said he didn't sleep for a month. They were so horrific. Um, how did church react to, I mean, it's amazing. A major figure murdered before a congressional testimony. How
yeah,
did they take that? What was the response?
We saw the photos, by the way. They are ugly.
Oh.
yeah. Gary Hart reacted more than anyone else on the committee. He was a member of the church committee.
Mhm.
He asked, when Rosselli was murdered, he asked church to let him go on behalf of the committee to Miami to investigate the murder.
Uh-huh.
And he then flew down with some church committee staffers to meet with the Miami-Dade police officers who were involved in the investigation. They could never prove uh, the connection between the church committee testimony and the murder. But I think, as I said earlier, I think it was part of a larger picture that
Mhm.
Rosselli was becoming a problem. He was an issue. He talked too much to a lot of different people, and I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
Sancho Trafficante clearly had a role too. He was he had an agenda because he was also a drug runner because it's Florida. It's Florida, it's perfect. So Cuba was a stopover for his drug running, like, heroin and everything, and on the transatlantic trips. So he thought, okay, if I don't get my casinos, maybe I can keep that connection there because, corrupt Cuban police, communist capitalists, whatever, they're going to want bribes.
Right.
So he
The
may
police.
have,
I'm sorry. Go
he,
ahead.
there was a phone call to Sancho Trafficante down the street from Rosselli the day he disappeared, like around the same time. There was FBI tapping his phones. So someone called him from a payphone, like right before Rosselli disappeared. This does not look good for Sancho Trafficante.
Right.
And
Right.
the Miami-Dade police files that we got also say that the FBI had an informant who told them that Tony Accardo, had approved a hit by Trafficante. And Trafficante carried it out or ordered it, but that the Chicago mob authorized it.
Right. Well, just stepping back a little bit, the Castro assassination plots are just one of the abuses of power that the church committee uncovered. And I don't think you can understand the story of the church committee without understanding it was a very broad investigation. And I mean, to me, that's how I learned about the CIA. I mean, I read other books, but to me, the first time I really understood the CIA in the fullness of what it did was reading, the church committee report. So what else did church do besides investigate the Castro assassination plots?
Oh, Tom, you want to add? Go ahead. Or
Yeah.
Well, I think there were four assassinations of foreign leaders that they investigated. Rafael Trujillo in Dominican Republic,
Mhm.
Ngo Dinh in South Vietnam, and Patrice Lumumba in Congo. And the big one,
there was also Renee Schneider in Chile.
thank
Yeah.
you, yes, yeah. We divided up the research, so Dad could talk about Schneider in Chile, which is getting more attention because there was an anniversary and new documents were released about that. And that was, the Nixon administration. So they found some Nixon dirty deeds related. And Frank Church was already investigating the Chile, Chile ties when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he was pretty interested in that one. And that was the overthrow of Allende. And Renee Schneider was part of that agenda there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The
Yeah.
so there were, I think, the assassinations of those foreign leaders. Then there was the big investigation that they had for the FBI was the investigation of how J. Edgar Hoover harassed Martin Luther King Jr. for years and years. The Church Committee really, their investigation of that was the first really major investigation that revealed what really happened. Then they also had a landmark investigation of the National Security Agency, which was the first ever congressional investigation of the NSA. And they also investigated MK Ultra and the CIA's mind control programs. So I would say that if you had to look at the top 4 or 5 investigations, that would be the foreign assassinations of foreign leaders, the Martin Luther King harassment by the FBI, the NSA investigation, and MK Ultra.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times, so I mean, a lot of what we know about the CIA in its first 30 years comes from the Church Committee.
Yeah.
And,
It's amazing how much really, if you look, this is what shocked me by getting into this research for the book was how much of what we now know comes from the Church Committee, and that most of the facts that we still know today come from the Church Committee's investigations of all these things. Not a lot has been added in those areas since the Church Committee.
The COINTELPRO side of the investigation that was led by Walter Mondale, the late vice president who was on the committee. Yeah, the FBI. This is like 2 years after the death of J. Edgar Hoover, so everyone is eager to flip and say, "Oh no, it was Hoover. He made me do it. He made me do it. He made me do it. I saw Hoover with the devil." You know, it's all that, but it's just all of that laundry comes out in the Church Committee reports. And to this day, COINTELPRO is into like almost everything about COINTELPRO came from the Church Committee. Especially that side of the investigation, like the Black Panthers, and we investigated, the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago, who was only 21, by the way. He was a 21-year-old activist, and Hoover was still afraid of him.
yeah.
And there's all this shady stuff about, investigating the peace movement and, civil rights groups. And, so much of that is still cutting edge when compared with what we know about, because the worst of it happened under Hoover, and Hoover died 2 years before the committee.
Right. So a lot of that stuff couldn't be investigated at that point.
Yeah, Walter Mondale told us that he doesn't think that their FBI investigation could have happened if Hoover was still alive at the time.
They would not have been able to investigate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think the NSA investigation is overlooked sometimes because the CIA stuff is more, sensational. But in the long term, the NSA surveillance, which was basically warrantless wiretapping,
Right.
that's what we saw in the Snowden revelations, that whole program that was exposed by the Church Committee had been massively expanded.
Right.
30 years later. And the Church Committee was almost prescient in calling attention to those kind of electronic surveillance capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the significance of that was that prior to the Church Committee, no one in Congress felt comfortable even admitting the existence of the NSA.
Mm-hmm.
There's never been a congressional hearing in which the NSA director testified in public. They had never had any oversight whatsoever. And the fact that they were forced, the NSA director, to testify in public, that they challenged him and that they investigated them and revealed their surveillance of US citizens is pretty remarkable. And it really, I think without what the Church Committee did on the NSA, Congress would never have been willing to conduct aggressive oversight of the NSA after that. I think it was a real precedent shattering moment.
Yeah. We're talking to Jim and Tom Risen, co-authors of the book The Last Honest Man. So I think you think Church deserves a lot of credit based on the title of your book for doing something that maybe nobody else would have done if he hadn't have done it.
Yeah, Tom, don't you think?
Yeah, I think at very least he deserves to not be vilified. You know, a lot of if you read a history of the CIA, it almost always treats the church committee as a footnote. And they say, oh, in the wake of Watergate, there was an investigation led by Senator Frank Church, who was grandstanding for his political ambitions, and it, crippled the CIA. And
Uh,
just it's usually invariably such a short description, and it vilifies Frank Church and makes him sound like a pompous grandstander, and he really wasn't at all. It's just there really hasn't been a story like the one we've told, where we dig into it, we talk to the people who are on the committee, and we did all the research. This is years of research we did, years of research and interviews. But I've not seen, I've been reading lots and lots of CIA history. I've not seen it go, no one's really gone in depth like this, except maybe Locke Johnson. And that's kind of, the academic side of it, where it's like, these are the people who are on the committee. This is what we did. This is what we did. It's not as much of a narrative as the one
yeah,
we're telling.
one
I
thing,
think I have a hobby, I have a pet peeve, if you don't mind me telling,
sure,
which is for some reason, the press in the 1970s, if you remember, Richard Helms got caught up in a perjury investigation,
yeah,
largely because of Frank Church. Frank Church conducted an investigation of the CIA's role in working with ITT in Chile. And he did that through another committee called it was a subcommittee on multinational corporations of the Foreign Relations Committee. And that started right before the Church Committee started. He then, Helms lied to the committee about the CIA's involvement in Chile and work with ITT, Church pushed for the Justice Department to prosecute him for perjury. And they did. They investigated it, they prosecuted it. And one of the weird things that I find as a journalist looking back is how much the press sympathized with Helms and took his side of this whole story. And,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
Helms became this martyr in Washington. And a lot of the CIA histories ever since have taken Helms's side and bashed Church and ridiculed him.
Right.
And they've also ridiculed William Colby, who was the CIA director after Helms, who was director while the Church Committee was operating.
Yeah.
And there was this long term, over the last 30 years, has been this long term feud between the supporters of Helms and the supporters of Colby. And most CIA people have come down on Helms's side. They think his reputation was unfairly trashed by Frank Church. And so that narrative has had a major effect on the way that the press and historians have viewed the Church Committee,
And
uh,
I would
including,
say, yeah,
including things like Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner, my former colleague, and other books about Helms, Tom Power's book about Helms. And so I think it's, like there's virtually no mention of the Church Committee in either Legacy of Ashes or Thomas Power's book on Helms.
And
yeah,
he deserves more credit.
yeah. Go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Tom.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think Church deserves more credit also because he was only scratching the surface. He was often more right than he knew in the Church Committee and in his multinational committee that Dad just mentioned, because the Lockheed and Northrop bribery scandals were happening in 1970. The same time he's doing the Church Committee, he's running back and forth between these two gigantic committees, and he uncovers bribery of the Prime Minister of Japan and all these other leaders by Lockheed and Northrop, and it leads to the formation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where it was technically legal to bribe a foreign government, just not an American politician. So now it's completely, directly illegal to do that. But he was more right than he knew. Like your book, Our Man in Mexico, I had been reading that about Winfield Scott. You talk about how the US government bribed 3 Mexican presidents and probably went beyond that. And, Eisenhower personally, approved bribery of the Japanese government. And who was the bag man? Lockheed. So
Yeah.
Lockheed learned bribery from the CIA. And Frank Church had no idea this was happening.
So yeah, and yet the press was sympathetic to Helms and Angleton, who subsequent revelations have showed had a great deal to hide about the assassination of Kennedy himself. Angleton had controlled the Oswald file. Helms had lied to the Warren Commission. And yet at the time, when the Church Committee was active, they got a lot of sympathy from the press. And Frank Church, who was really kind of the liberal crusader, got a hard time. What did Angleton say in particular about church? That in my book about Angleton, I looked at this a little bit, but I felt like I didn't really get to the bottom of it. Angleton and church were, Angleton was very anti-communist conservative. Church is a liberal trying to reform the CIA. What did Angleton feel about what church was doing?
Angleton hated church with a passion. The funny thing is, they were both from Boise, Idaho,
Yes.
and their families sort of knew each other back in Idaho.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Angleton blamed church for all of his woes. Right, in when Cy Hirsch's story was published in December 1974, at the time, Bill Colby was trying to get rid of Angleton. He believed that he was obsessive, paranoid, who had allowed Soviet operations of the CIA to be paralyzed by his constant witch hunts for moles. And he wanted to get rid of him. Then, right at the time that the Hirsch story comes out, he fires Angleton. He later claimed that it wasn't because of the Hirsch story, but it sure looked like it.
Mhm.
And Angleton then becomes incredibly bitter at the new Senate investigation that's been spawned by the Hirsch story. And he's an alcoholic, and he decides to start meeting regularly with one of the staffers on the church committee, and he's trying to do a traditional CIA seduction, except he's so drunk all the time at all of their meetings that he never really seduces the guy and just convinces the church committee staff that he's just an old drunk.
And
And
he's a drunk by CIA madman era standards. So if they think he's a drunk, that's pretty bad.
Right. This is the three martini lunch era, right?
He had 6. He had 6 glasses of Kier, which is like a fancy French liqueur.
yeah, yeah. And so then he finally is forced to testify in public at the church committee in the fall of 1975. And Church humiliates him with his grilling. And everybody had thought that Angleton was so smart, but he just falls apart during this hearing. And he never really recovered from that. His reputation was in tatters. So he became really bitter. And there's a lot of evidence that he was trying to destroy Church's reputation after that.
The story I heard was that he was going around telling people Church was a KGB agent, objectively speaking, or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, Church. Well, we can't prove that it was Angleton, but it's almost certainly Angleton.
Uh-huh.
Church told his son in 1976. He did run for president. He lost to Jimmy Carter, and then after the primaries, Jimmy Carter was considering him to be his vice presidential running mate. And Carter writes in his memoir that if his initial decision had come through, he would have picked Church. But then Church was passed over for Mondale instead. And Church told his son on a vacation that he was convinced it was because of the leaks coming from the CIA that the church committee was filled with KGB agents.
Mhm.
And that he said he had gotten a call from the CIA, someone at the CIA, he didn't tell his son who it was, that The Economist was about to run a major story that the church committee had been infiltrated by the KGB. And then Church and his people looked into it and they found out that the name of the reporter they had been given was fictitious. And The Economist never ran any such story. And he assumed that other people, that the CIA was telling the same thing to other people around town.
Mhm.
So he became convinced that that was one reason that Carter didn't pick him, which
I
Mhm.
may
think he
have
tried to
been,
influence his loss in 1980 as well, right?
yeah. And then in 1980, when he ran for re-election in the Senate from Idaho, Angleton, who was from Boise, went to Steve Sims, who was a House member, from a congressman from Idaho, and kept telling him he had to run against Church because Church was so terrible. And he started filling Sims's head with crap from the CIA about Church.
Mhm.
And Sims told me this story that Angleton would come to his office and they would sit there and he would smoke constantly and tell him how much he had to run against Church. And Sims did run and he beat Church. And then Sims told me that right after the election, he was invited to a big party in Washington to celebrate. And he said, I was the only non-CIA person there. So
So they were all celebrating the defeat of
yeah,
Frank.
yeah, yeah.
Wow. What was the I think another reason why the church committee matters today is everything that followed, right? After this massive investigation, the release of the church committee final report is released when? Early in the Carter administration, right?
March 76, I think.
1976 in the
Okay.
spring.
And what's the impact in Washington?
It has enormous impact. The first thing that happened was the Senate voted in favor of a permanent Senate Intelligence Committee right after the Church Committee issued its final report, which was the original goal of creating the committee by Mansfield. He wanted a committee that did good work so that he could convince both the Senate and the White House and other people in Washington that Congress could conduct oversight. And the fact that the Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor of a permanent Senate Intelligence Committee was seen certainly by Frank Church as an endorsement of what he had done. Then not long after that, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was passed and signed into law by Carter in 1978. That was to deal with domestic spying by the CIA and the NSA.
Mhm.
And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as Tom mentioned, was passed in the Carter administration after he had uncovered the foreign bribery by Lockheed and other companies. And the CIA was Ford and then Carter imposed a lot of new executive orders on the CIA to limit their operations and restrict what they could do. And the FBI imposed a lot of new internal guidelines and orders on how they operated. So there was really a massive change in the way in which the intelligence community operated.
And one of the big results of the investigation is more investigations, because a couple of years after, there was an investigation of, as your listeners will know, there's the assassinations investigation, which follows up, and they
Yes.
dig into the Kennedy assassination more. And they don't, I think that the general, they say, oh, we waited too long to do this improper, because the Warren Commission wasn't a good investigation. They say it might have been a conspiracy with JFK, but they dig more into all the stuff that kind of came about in the church committee with the assassinations, but also MK Ultra. You mentioned the mind control experiments, which I think is the most damning, if I can swear on your podcast, thing, because they were so busy they had one researcher do all the interviews and writing and research on MK Ultra. This because it came out by accident in the family jewels, and there was not a lot of detail on it because most of the records were destroyed. But they go, for the lack of information they have, they do a pretty good job in the Church report. But a couple of years later, more Senate investigations happen, led by the newly created Intelligence Committee. And many, many years, over the decades, there's more Freedom of Information Act requests and people who realize their family members might have been drugged or tortured or whatever. And so there's more and more and more discovered. So the Church Committee really opens the floodgates on a lot of
No,
things.
and I think that's really important. That's why I wanted to have you guys on the show, because when I talk to people about the JFK story or the CIA in general, I just realize how much of it comes from church and the church committee and its influence. It's
You know,
really
there was a subcommittee on the CIA's performance during the Kennedy assassination.
yeah, and I wanted to explain that the church committee did not investigate the assassination per se. What
Right.
did they do?
Well, Gary Hart and Richard Schweiker, who was a Republican senator on the committee, they both were interested in what they had found out about. They saw the Castro assassination, CIA mafia plots, and they said, how is it possible that this didn't impact the Kennedy assassination? They didn't know, but what they knew, they couldn't reinvestigate the whole Kennedy assassination. But what they wanted to do was just look at the CIA's performance as an intelligence agency during the time of the Kennedy assassination. And so it was not a full-blown investigation, but it was critical of what the CIA had not told the Warren Commission. And there was Gary Hart told me a great line, which was that as part of that, he had dinner with James Angleton. And he asked Angleton, is there more about the Kennedy assassination at the CIA than we know? And he said, Angleton just looked at him and said, in my father's house, there are many mansions.
That's vintage Angleton. I love that one.
Leaving you to figure out whatever does that mean.
Right. Gary Hart said, I was a divinity student, so I knew the scriptural reference.
So the church committee has this big impact in Congress, creation of committees, new laws. What's the political impact longer term? I mean, church doesn't win for president. There's a backlash at the CIA. Church is turned out of the Senate. Reagan's elected. What's the long-term impact of the church committee? What can we learn from them?
I think the long-term impact is that he forced the U.S. Intelligence Committee to operate under the rule of law for the first time. They created all of these new laws and executive orders and other administrative restrictions, and a change in the culture and the thinking at the CIA about congressional oversight, and created congressional oversight for the first time. And so the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, and the rest of the Intelligence Committee were really brought into, and their operations were restricted in ways that they had never been before. And if you think about it, a lot of certainly the CIA continued to commit egregious acts, and was involved in lots of scandals. But the scandals after that generally involved a failure to report to Congress on what they were doing, which prior to the Church Committee, they didn't have to do anyway.
Right.
So Contra, for instance, probably the biggest scandal between the Church Committee and 9/11.
Not even 10 years later.
Yeah, was largely because the CIA was ignoring congressional legislative mandates on refusal to, on the ban on supporting the Nicaraguan Contras, and a failure to report covert action to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And so it was a scandal directly because the Church Committee had imposed new limits on the CIA that they were chafing under and didn't want to follow. And I think the greatest endorsement of the power of the Church Committee came after 9/11, when Vice President Dick Cheney attacked the Church Committee in this weird series of rants that no one who didn't know the whole history wouldn't have been able to understand. He started in public attacking the Church Committee in 2001 and 2002, like 20 years after, more than 25 years after the Church Committee existed, 20 years after Frank Church was dead. He started attacking Frank Church as the reason why the US had failed to foresee the terrorist attacks. And Henry Kissinger went before the Senate and said the same thing. And it showed you that the right wing of the Republican Party had always chafed at the limits imposed by the Church Committee on civil liberties and due process, forcing the intelligence community to be part of the American government for the first time.
Yeah.
I mean, they do. I always view the CIA is allowed to go anywhere they want as long as they don't get caught. I mean, they do what they want if they think they really need to do it. Like Iran-Contra proves that. Congress tells them don't do something, they do it anyway because they think they have to. But I think a good endorsement of the book is from William Colby's grandson, Elbridge Colby. I talked with him, and he actually worked with the Trump administration briefly, as like a State Department attaché or something. And he thinks all those arguments that the Church Committee hobbled the CIA, he said, that's garbage. How did we win the Cold War?
Yeah.
It's they do what they got the job done no matter what. I don't know what they're paying attention to if they think it's destroyed the agency.
Mhm.
Well, I think that the difference was that prior to the Church Committee, there was no oversight, there were no rules really. After the Church Committee, there were rules and there was oversight, and the CIA continued to violate them, but there were actually rules in place.
So the difference before Church and after is that there was some accountability or some
Right.
system of accountability that could be made to work or invoked
Right.
by the people who wanted to establish accountability.
Yeah, I always think of it, it's like laws against bank robbery haven't stopped bank robbery,
Right.
but you have a law there.
Right. Yeah.
I like to think that the Senate Intelligence Committee would at least say no to MK Ultra if they said, "Hello, we would like $4 million to mass produce LSD." No, if something clearly bad
Yeah.
would not get approved.
The book is The Last Honest Man, Life and Times of Frank Church by James and Thomas Risen. Thank you guys for telling us about this. I really want to do this because, like I say, I think this is indispensable education for anybody who wants to know about this period in American history, about the Cold War in American history, what was going on. This is the Church Committee is absolutely central. So
thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for doing that. So there's a new edition of the book out, you were saying, James?
The paperback is coming out in May.
Uh-huh.
And then Frank Church's 100th birthday is this year.
Yeah, well, it's a very entertaining read about really an unjustly forgotten man. I thought I knew the story, and after I read your book, I realized I didn't. So
well, thanks.
I recommend it to all readers, all viewers of JFK Facts. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
And let's talk again.
Great. Thanks again for having us.
Take care.
Bye.